uh, shop, Paul. I'm curious. So you have a farm in Southwest Virginia. Is this right?
I do, yes. We have about 100 acres out in the mountains. 25-minute drive to Roanoke, or where I taught at Roanoke College. Um, Picked up the land 25 years ago when it was still cheap, and then built a house out here in 2005. So we're almost 20 years living on the land here. But
Okay.
we really didn't start farming till about 2012. So I have cattle, um, and honeybees and chickens.
And did you grow up farming?
No, I grew up in the suburbs of New York City.
So, all right. So, have you just taught yourself how to do this?
Yeah, I guess so. It wasn't really in the family, and it started with a love of gardening, and to tell you the truth, with small game hunting for rabbits and ruffed grouse and such. And I just started getting very interested in nature and ecology, and one thing led to another. And I had some years in Central Europe. I taught in Slovakia for
Hmm.
6 years in the 90s, and the whole way of life out there is my students every weekend would Friday jump on the trains to go back to the village for the weekend, and where they would help the family with the big garden. And it was a very rural way of life, and that's my ancestry there too. So that was another connection leading to this.
Okay. Well, my grandfather was a cattleman, and so to go from gardening to cattle is a big, it's a big leap.
I was very fortunate. A member of the congregation learned that I was interested in farming, and he had been nurturing this breed of Irish Dexter, which was an endangered species 25, 30 years ago. And he had been successful with it, but wanted to start moving him out of Dexter's into Galloways. And so he sold me a starter herd and advised me, and taught me the basics of cattlemanship. So um, I was very lucky that way. And the Irish Dexters are a very docile breed.
Hmm.
No fear of them, like a big old Angus or something coming at you.
So you were catechized into cattle.
You would say so.
Speaking of catechism, I know you through your daughter, who I went to seminary with, and uh, to say Sarah is unique is an understatement. And so she's very smart, very opinionated, very forthright about her convictions. Um, and so, you and your wife did a good job with her. But B, I'm curious, you know, was it just organic, or were you and your wife intentional about forming her in the faith?
That's a very interesting question. At the time she was a child, I was a pastor. So she kind of grew up by osmosis in the bosom of a very happy congregation that had a very positive influence on her. Not so true of my son years
Mm.
later. And she was the eldest and bright, and when I was a graduate student at Union, um, my wife, Ellen, went to work full time, and I was at home studying. So I was Mr. Mom, basically for her very early years. That formed a kind of a special connection too.
Hmm.
But intentional in the faith, she went to Sunday school, church, and catechism. I was very traditional with confirmation instruction. They had to learn Luther's catechism and a lot of the Bible,
Hmm.
and they had to spend 2 years at it, and then they had to write an essay for the congregation to read. So that was pretty intensive formation, I would say.
And so talk a little bit about your own formation, because when I first happened upon you, um, and started reading you, um, I was struck by um, how familiar your theology felt to me. as someone who had already read Robert Jensen and Karl Barth. And I think I've only started to appreciate that there are different streams within Lutheran theology. And the one you're in, whatever that is, feels more at home to someone who, was formed at Princeton Theological Seminary.
Sure. I would say right now, my biggest theological friends, now that's not personal friends, but people I feel close to theologically, are Philip Ziegler and Bruce McCormick.
Okay. He was my teacher. He's a good guy. And Philip Ziegler he's quite good too.
Yeah. I have a lot of sympathy with those two guys. And the commonality in a lot of that is J. Lewis Martin, especially with Ziegler and Paul Lehman. Those were influences on me at Union Seminary.
What attracted you into the field of theology?
I don't know. I think I was fated for it. I have to say, I grew up my father was a pastor, but it was an ethnic congregation. A Slovak, who ever heard of Slovaks? Slovaks, this tiny little minority in the middle of Europe. They're like the West Virginia of Europe, but they had, at the time of the Reformation, about 70% of the Slovak people became Lutheran. And they were Lutheran for 100 years before the Counter-Reformation converted them back to Catholicism. So the Lutherans had this strong self-consciousness of being a persecuted minority. And that made them very progressive on social issues against the conservatism of the Catholic Church. But they were also theologically quite conservative. And you would almost say a formula of conquered fundamentalists, something along those lines. Anyway, that's kind of the tradition I grew up in. We were blessed not to be like the Germans in the Missouri Synod with their Prussian rigidity and pigheadedness. They were much more congenial and pastoral. And that was my childhood formation. But by the time of the tumultuous 60s, Jason, everything was being thrown into doubt, into question, and so forth and so on. And as a senior in high school, I decided to read the New Testament for myself. And I went out and bought a copy of Phillips' translation into modern English. And I was reading it, and the scales fell from the eyes, And I kept saying to my father, "But the Sermon on the Mount says," And of course, then we started getting into great theological discussions. And I remember I came home from high school having read the play "Inherit the Wind" about the Scopes trial. And I started spouting off to my father everything that the lawyer said in the cross-examination. Why, if the sun had stood still, the earth would have been thrown off of his axis, hurled into the upper depths.
It's funny. I played that lawyer at a high school play. That's funny.
I'm trying to remember his name. Do you remember his name?
No, I don't. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, Spencer Tracy played him in the movie. But, my father, then the Bible. So all we have to, and of course, there's some truth in that. Well, Protestantism stands on the Bible. If the Bible disintegrates, well, what happens to Protestantism? What we see today.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what attracted me to Jensen from the beginning, was that he had such a sophisticated way of dealing with the Bible as source and norm of theology. That avoided all the pitfalls of fundamentalism, and yet was cognitively and substantively thick, and made strong dogmatic claims. And I just found that endlessly interesting in Jensen.
Were the two of you friends, acquaintances?
Well, there's a backstory. Um, I don't know if I want you ever to go public with this, but um, when I was struggling to finish my doctoral dissertation, I read Jensen's Triune Identity,
Hmm.
which had just come out, and I loved it. And it finally allowed me to put the finishing touches on my dissertation. It was a dissertation on the Gospel of Mark, arguing for the temporality of God.
Hmm.
And Jensen's approach allowed me to articulate what I meant by the temporality of God. And when was done with it, I showed the material to Jensen, and we became friends, kind of critical friends, because we had a rather vigorous debate about nuclear deterrence that was
Really?
published in a Lutheran journal. Um, uh, he was for unilateral nuclear disarmament. And if Europe got taken over by the Soviets, that would be God's will. And I just found that crazy.
Well, that's a position that's consistent with his theology, I guess.
And I was, of course, also influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr's Christian realism. And so we had quite a debate about that. So we were not two peas in a pod. But there was an opening at Gettysburg Seminary where he was teaching for a junior position in theology. And he invited me to apply. And then I became his pet candidate, which was very quickly perceptible to the entire faculty. And I came, and I have this on testimony from many of the students who were there at the time. I hands down won the competition and should have been given the appointment. In my final faculty interview, in front of the entire faculty, almost the very last question came to me from a professor of practical theology. And she asked me, as a systematic theologian, what would you do with the social sciences? And my wise ass, smart alecky answer was, well, that's assuming that the social sciences are science. That comment started a civil war on the faculty over my candidacy. And the president finally had to cancel the search because if I had been appointed, it would have been civil war. And Jensen, I think, was so disgusted by that, that's precipitated his move to St. Olaf College.
Hmm. That's
So
interesting.
we were friends all through the years, and I helped them start the journal Pro Ecclesia. I was an associate editor with that. And, and then towards when I started publishing books, he read them and endorsed them and stuff like that. He was a kind of a personality. It wasn't always easy to warm up to, but
As someone who delivered mail to him at the institute, I I was intimidated by him, to say the least.
yeah.
One of your books that I have just been reading recently for myself is Preaching God's Word According to Lutherans' Doctrine in America Today. And I also have read The Substance of the Faith, which is kind of a related theme. And so I'm just curious how you would articulate, what is the most relevant part of Luther's contribution for the church in America today?
That's interesting that you asked that. I was just asked to write an essay for Lutheran Quarterly under the rubric How My Mind Has Changed. I began by saying that I was fortunate as a seminary student way back when to have a guided reading in Luther's tracts from the 1520s. That's Against the Heavenly Prophets, Bondage of the Will, Confession Concerning Christ's Supper, That These Words of Christ, This Is My Body, May Forever Stand, and his little treatise against rebaptism. And what struck me, Jason, in all of this reading was Luther's comment. Up until now, referring to the early years of the Reformation. I have been writing about the subject of faith, which is the better part. Now, by subject of faith, he meant faith. He meant the believer who believes.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the anthropological focus of the for me, that given and shed for me. Uh, Faith takes the gospel and says, this applies to me. And Luther says, up until now, I've been emphasizing that which is the better part. But because of the outbreak of heresy by the 1520s, Luther says, I am now forced to talk about the object of faith, what faith is faith in, what faith is invested in. And of course, for Luther, that's his very particular and strong doctrine of Jesus Christ as the incarnate Son of God, who comes in a self-donating fashion to give himself wholly into the hands of and for the sake of sinners. And I found that appeal to objectivity, to the object of faith, that Luther himself makes. So you can't distinguish that from Luther's legacy. Luther himself makes this move. I found that move to objectivity so important for myself back in the early 1970s when I was in seminary. And it was like the segue to my later interest in Karl Barth, and then, of course, Jensen.
Yeah, one of the breakthroughs for me reading Jensen was his clarification that the doctrine of justification is just the doctrine of predestination, but flipped around, and that it's not something we put our faith in. It's a way that we talk about Jesus.
Right.
And that was incredibly helpful. And once you get it, it seems obvious, but I think it eludes a lot of people.
I think so too. When they try to turn justification into the object of faith, then what you basically have is fideism, faith in faith, and then faith in faith traps you again into the endless pit of, do I have faith? Do I have enough faith? Do I have the right kind of faith? And so you're right back where you started from. The faith justifies, or faith alone justifies, only because it's only focused on Christ alone. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is what Jensen was getting at all along. Yeah.
And I think that's not unrelated to one of the, I think, distinctive contributions that you and Sarah make in your conversations is a healthy and faithful retention of God's law. They're speaking only as an outsider. There is a stream of Lutheranism in the West where it seems like the only contribution Luther has made is it veers on antinomianism.
Quite so. Yes, I think that's right. And it's connected, of course, Jason, with the deep issue of anti-Judaism and how it runs all through the story of Christian theology, and how Luther is not exceptional in his noxious remarks about Jews, but is actually representative of the entire preceding Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. Almost the entire. I mean, there's small exceptions along the way, but using Judaism as a figure for what the gospel has overcome, rather than understanding Judaism as the mother which gave birth to Christianity, I think, and therefore the law, which is so highly revered in Judaism, as the gift of God, which turns against us when we have turned against God.
Yeah, it's one of the things that surprised me too, is, so as an outsider, and you get a taste of Luther from Lutherans who speak only of God's grace, And then you go and you read Luther's sermons, and it's, well, this isn't. He's talking about the law all the time. And so, yeah, it was kind of surprising to me to go back and reread some of the stuff I'd forgotten from seminary, and the guy that's on the page is different than the guy that's in the cultural ether.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I wrote this one of my last books I published is called Lutheran Theology, A Critical Introduction.
Yeah,
And
I've got that.
I have pointed out the simple fact that Luther's got this vast literary legacy. I mean, you can find anything you want in something Luther wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And every age, every epoch has selectively quoted or drawn from the literary legacy to create a Luther that's useful to it. I mean, that's just like the quest for the historical Jesus. You have the same thing going on. And for a lot of reasons, after the hegemony of Kant's philosophy in Germany from the early 19th century, there was kind of this widespread cultural rebellion culminating in Nietzsche against the arid um, moralism of 19th century theology. And the by the time of existentialism in the early 20th century, it was felt that what we need to be liberated from was imperatives that are crushing us and killing us and laying guilt trips on us and they're just power plays anyway. And so liberation from the law became the great gospel of existentialist theology. Um, no one imposes any laws on you. You are free to be whatever you want to be. And I think that toxic elixir is still percolating through our culture more broadly than Lutherans.
And this is, because one of your books is about doing theology in light of Auschwitz. And I was very impressed with the conversation that you and Sarah had immediately after October 7th.
Oh, yeah.
And since October 7th, I've been doing a weekly conversation with a rabbi that I've befriended. So I'm just, it's almost a year now from that horrible crime. So I'm just wondering. So I'm used to hearing from a Jewish rabbi talking about how he sees the world. I'm wondering what insights about the October 7th and its aftermath that you think are important for Christians to keep before them.
I think that I'm right now considering the way the war has gone and the terrible suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza, which I want to acknowledge right off the bat. I'd like to stipulate that as a presupposition of what I'm about to say, because the sooner the war can be ended for the sake of those suffering people, the better. That's just, goes without saying. I've said it there, so it's stipulated. But what really concerns me is the inflation of the word genocide, in which it ceases to be a descriptor of an intention to utterly decimate an entire people. That's what the word genocide means etymologically, and how it originated, I think, basically, and came into common usage after the Holocaust to describe the Nazi intention to make Europe Jew-free. And so then from there it was generalized into the human rights ideas of the early United Nations and described as a crime against humanity, the intentional destruction of a population of people based on race or ethnicity. And having said that, if we describe the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza as an attempted genocide, it simply does not make any sense. Even if we believe Hamas's statistics of 40,000 Palestinians killed in these 9 months, even if we believe that, which I don't, but for the sake of argument, let's say 40,000 persons have been killed in Gaza. And even if only half of them are Hamas militants, 20,000 civilian deaths out of a population of 3 million is not an attempted genocide.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the ugliness of war. If we had used this criteria in 1944-45, we would have stopped at the Rhine River and called for a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
This is madness. It does, this inflation of the word genocide does two terrible things. It obscures the utter brutality of modern warfare. If you start a war, baby, this is what you're going to get, and it's going to be awful. And the other thing it does is that it, as a slur word, as a smear word, it makes unintelligible the real war crimes that Israel has committed in this war. If you throw the blanket descriptor genocide, you overlook the fact that there are many particular acts that should rightly be called out as overreaches that are war crimes. So I think this confusion over Israel's faults in the war, it also obscures the fact, as Sinwar has admitted, that using the civilian population of Gaza as cover for the militants is a deliberate strategy meant to evoke world sympathy.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just, those are my comments about I mean, we have to be, as Christian theologians, we have to be as innocent as dove, but as wise as serpents. And not being able to think clearly and see clearly, the ideological inflation of language or manipulation of language to continue war by other means is a terrible intellectual fault, an intellectual vice among contemporary Christians.
That's helpful. That's you mentioned earlier you and Robert Jensen disagreeing about nuclear disarmament policy. And so, as someone older than me, I'm wondering. So in the back of my head, I recently discovered that my wife and I will be out of the country the Sunday after the election, so I don't have to worry about preaching. And so I have that in the back of my head. But I'm just wondering, is trying to engage the public square as a Christian more difficult now, or does it just seem to me that it is?
Well, it's a moving target, Jason. It's the American public, I mean, is a moving target. In some ways, you could say we don't have a public anymore. We're all in our silos. We're all in our ghettos. We all have our own versions. Both of the major political parties piously claim to be saving our democracy. And if you have enough imagination, you can get in the heads of either side and see how either side can make a plausible case for that.
Mm-hmm.
That's convincing to themselves, and they're fighting over the minority in the middle that sees the overreaches on both sides and worries, like I do, about what I call Weimarization, where the Weimar Republic, was a democracy in Germany from the end of the war till Hitler's ascension to power. And it came undone. It came undone by a terrible polarization in which Reds and Browns were doing street battles.
Mm-hmm.
Private militias were being organized to protect political parties against attempted assassinations, et cetera, et cetera. So I wish Christians were smart enough to realize that the major political parties in the United States are both instruments of the same kind of uh, um, um, alliances of corporate power with um, um, lobbyists through their lobbyists with the political regime. I used to be a Democrat, and the Democrats were against the national security state.
Hmm.
Now, now they depend on the national security estate. Democrats used to be suspicious of corporations. Now they're on the payroll of corporations and so forth. And I could say the same things about Republicans who, ever since George W. Bush, have embarrassed themselves beyond telling, and they ended up with this scoundrel demagogue who is their nominee. So you ask me what I think about the election, I'll probably hold my nose and vote for one or the other, but I might just stay home.
Hmm.
For the first time in my life since I cast my first vote in 1974 for George McGovern.
So that's not unrelated to this book on preaching that I referenced. Uh, Talk about what prompted um, the sermons that are included in this book, and how you went about executing those kinds of sermons.
That's a great question. Thank you. I had been teaching at Roanoke College for about 5 or 6 years when my wife had a bout with breast cancer, and after she successfully, thank God, uh, emerged from that, we decided that we just needed lifestyle changes. That's when we decided to build the house out here in the country and move out here. But it's also when uh, the bishop of my synod, with whom I developed a very good relationship, um, um, somehow told me, I learned that about a 20-mile drive away, there was a 2 Point rural parish in need of a pastor. And I got
Where where in
and
Virginia was this?
this outside of Blacksburg, outside of
Okay.
Virginia, Blacksburg. And this was old coal miner country, and all these folks in these congregations, their daddies had been coal miners.
Hmm.
And it's in the mountains of Virginia. And the bishop was talking to me about this because it would have been a part-time call, but while I was full-time teaching in Roanoke, I said I can't really swing that. But what if my wife and I took this ministry as a team ministry, and
Hmm.
she did the administrative and work and so forth through the week, and I basically was a Sunday morning preacher and for emergencies and such. So we agreed on that arrangement, and the people were delighted to have us. We had a wonderful 5 years there. Um, but about halfway into that, I started getting adults wanting baptism, and to prepare them, I had to catechize them. And so in the Lutheran Church, we have a tradition of sometimes in Advent and Lent of Wednesday night services. So I told the people, instead of having the usual Lenten services this year, I'm going to teach Luther's catechism for the sake of these new people. But if anybody else would like to join, please come. Well, I was amazed. They just turned out in droves. And, Pastor, we have never heard of this stuff before. This is wonderful. And I said, yeah, I think it is pretty wonderful. And anyway, that was kind of the genesis of this book. And after that experience, I said, for a summer season, I'm going to um, set aside the lectionary and spend a summer preaching through the Apostles' Creed or something. I think something like that. Some basic points in Christian doctrine. And
So at
that's
that point at that point your daughter hadn't convinced you that the lectionary is terrible.
I still don't think the lectionary is terrible. I think that it's a crying shame that pastors are so poorly educated that they can't handle the lectionary preaching. That they have to pick and choose one verse out of the 3 lessons to go off on a tangent that has little to do with exegesis, let alone theology.
Touche. Did you find it hard to go from professor mode to pastor catechizer mode?
I personally do not find that hard. I've been a classroom teacher for so many years. It's not all that different, particularly when you're teaching first year seminarians or college freshmen. I mean, you know, the art of teaching is something, you know, perhaps you have to learn through experience, but I didn't find the transition very hard at all. And I've always, you know, I grew up in a parsonage, so I just knew the ministry from the inside from the beginning.
So, one of the books that I have that you have written, I've only dipped into it occasionally, is this commentary on what may be one of the most frightening books of the Bible, the book of Joshua. How did that happen?
That's another funny story. When Brazzo's series of theological commentaries on the Bible was first announced, I was busy still with other book writing projects. But when I was ready for a new challenge, I contacted Rusty Reno, the editor, and said I'd love to do the commentary on the Gospel of Mark. Well, he replied, that's long ago been claimed. I said, well, and then he mentioned some other possibilities. None of them interested me, so I just dropped it. Well, I guess after numerous attempts to find someone to write on Joshua, he went to Sarah. And I got to say, excuse me a minute.
It's okay.
And Sarah sat down to read Joshua. She got up to chapter 8 and she closed the book and said, no way. I'm not writing about this genocidal book. Right. And when Sarah told me that story, I said, well, gee, that sounds like an interesting challenge. And so went to the other, and I was given the assignment. And I spent, you know, a good year of my life reading everything I could find on Joshua. And then another year of my life sitting down. And then, of course, I had to renew my Hebrew, which I hadn't used much since seminary. So I invested quite a bit into writing this commentary, which I'm very pleased with. And the reviews have been quite good, too.
It's a book that only Sam Peckinpah could like. I think it's pretty grim. So it's you've mentioned Mark a couple of times now in our conversation. What is why do you like the Gospel of Mark so much?
J. Lewis Martin is the short answer. I really loved him and had a number of associations with him as a graduate student. He finally served on my doctoral committee. But he announced a seminar on the Gospel of Mark. And I was not in biblical studies, but he gave me permission to join the seminar. And that included Joel Marcus, who wrote the great big commentary, 2-volume Anchor Bible commentary on Mark later in life. And I think Marcus DeBoer was in there too. Martinus DeBoer is who I'm thinking of. Anyway, this was a very dynamic seminar on the Gospel of Mark. Lou said at the beginning of the class, your only homework for this class is to read the Gospel of Mark in Greek every week. And that was really a wonderful thing, discipline to do. And then we would come to class and debate particular passages, and Lou would sit there like a rabbi and make judicious interventions and comments and so forth. And I just became fascinated with the Gospel of Mark because, of course, I had been trained in seminary on Bultmann's form critical approach for which the Gospel of Mark was, quote, pearls strung together on a string, pearls on a string. In other words, little juicy little stories about Jesus that had no connection to one another, that were just stitched together artificially, which of course made the gospel as a whole almost a meaningless assemblage of stories. And when we were reading Mark like this intensively and sequentially, it became very, very clear what a sophisticated author Mark was in the way he compiled stories and the narrative connections he made between them, all of which then, of course, this was Martin's huge insight for us, all of which led to the gospel being understood in the genre of apocalyptic. So that if you do not perceive with the centurion, the executioner, at the final hour that truly this was the Son of God, you're never going to get it. And resurrection stories aren't going to help you.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just mind-boggling insight at that time, that was the literary purpose of the Gospel of Mark, to provide an apocalyptic experience.
Yeah, I remember reading the Gospel of Mark with Donald Jewell at Princeton. Had I not been a Christian before that, it would have made me one.
Yeah, Jewell was a great theologian and biblical scholar, much appreciated. I loved his book on Old Testament exegesis, or what's the name of that book? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I have it. Yeah, I can't remember the name of it.
It was, how early Christians used did not turn to the Old Testament for proof texts, but in order to understand the novelties of the gospel. That, I think, is really interesting and valuable insight.
So talk a little bit about how the project with Sarah, Queen of the Sciences, came about.
Oh, man. Allow me to say we're in the middle of our fifth year or sixth year. I don't remember anymore. We're in the middle of our 6th year. And to my amazement, this somewhat heavy for a podcast, and we often go over an hour on kind of a range of esoteric topics for a layman, right? We've gone over 100,000 downloads. It's amazing to me.
Well, I mean, just as a testimonial, I was out in California guest preaching, and I did a long run along the beach for about 12 miles, and I listened to the two of you talk about Foucault and technology.
Yeah, we do that, and then we do things on books of the Bible, like Nehemiah, that Ezra and Nehemiah that nobody else reads, and Jude, and right now we're doing Jude and Second Peter. So yeah, we're all over the map, but it's been fun. And how it originated was when Sarah and her husband Andrew took a call 6 years ago to teach at Tokyo Lutheran University and Seminary. She dealt with the separation of living on the other side of the world by proposing to me that we go public with our theological conversations. And she said that she would do all the work in terms of setting up the technology and editing the files and publishing them and so forth. And if I would help out a little bit financially with setting that up, and just be willing to do it with her. I think about 2 years ago, we had an episode retrospecting on our experience, in which I burst out saying, "Man, this is a lot of work." Because, you have to actually prepare. You can't just BS your way through the kind of podcast that we're trying to do. You really want to be instructive and educational and say something that will be of value to the auditors and so forth. So that's how it came about, and it's been so good that at the end of every season, we're generating a list of topics for the next one.
Okay, that was going to be my next question because one of the things I admire about it is how wide ranging it is, and how the two of you um, don't necessarily agree all the time.
Oh, do two human beings ever necessarily agree all the time? Where two or three are gathered, there is disagreement in the midst of them. I just think but actually, I think that's fun. I think that's
Hmm.
interesting. I think that's stimulating. Um, I think that's what's wrong with our political
Oh
parties.
yeah, I was just going to say. I mean, I think it's a good witness that you guys offer how to talk about matters that matter in a way that's civil and Christian, um, but often in disagreement.
Yeah, I think uh, disagreement sometimes causes a little bit of anxiety between us, but I think we face it and master it. And actually, uh, one of the things I learned from George Lindbeck is that the art of community means learning how to agree to disagree, to agree upon what the disagreement is,
Hmm.
so that you have clarity about, you actually move the argument forward, that you're not just throwing bricks at each other or something, but you're actually trying. It's a common search for truth, and discord or disagreement is a necessary. I'm sounding very Hegelian here, I realize. It's a necessary moment on the journey to greater uh, consciousness of the truth.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I've been struck by over the last couple of years is my own denomination is now has gone through the sexuality debate and schism that I know you and Sarah navigated in your own tradition.
Right.
But uh, going through that at the congregational level, it struck me how as much as Americans argue and disagree in our silos online, we're not good at all about doing it in person,
Right.
face to face. And so it's yeah, we just don't, we avoid it, and we don't have a lot of adeptness with it.
We did a couple of episodes this season on Jacques Ellul, who I think is an enormously prescient thinker. Um, he was writing his books in the 40s through the 60s, and his book on propaganda is,
Hmm.
I think, it could have been written yesterday to describe the state of our discourse,
Hmm.
uh, in which everything is spin, everything's propaganda, all the way up, all the way down. And even the claim to check facts is a form of
Yeah.
propaganda. It's just awful. But I think, Jason, the deeper truth he illustrated in this analysis of our suffering discourse is that in a mass society in which we have been atomized, ripped out of our traditional anchoring in church, family, nation, tribe, literary traditions, and we've become these isolated individuals living in a huge mass of other isolated individuals. Both the need for identity and the ability to acquire an identity have become entirely problematic. And people's egos, as a result, are so fragile that any appearance of criticism cannot but be perceived as a personal attack.
Hmm.
It's not that I disagree with you about a particular policy, it's that you are threatening my life, by which they really mean you're threatening my fragile construction of an ego identity in this mass culture by which I hold the forces of chaos at bay. you're threatening my mental stability or something like that. And I think that's just a very dangerous position because it sets us up for a Pied Piper, for a charismatic authoritarian figure who's going to deliver us from the chaos once and for all.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember that conversation that the two of you had on a little. Um, so you have a website that people should check out, paulhinlicky.com. You've been doing a series of posts on Johan Hari. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So who is Johan Hari?
Well, I don't know him personally. I've just read his book. Um, when I was a college professor 7 or 8 years ago, I was just struck by the epidemic of depression among my students.
Hmm.
And I had grown close to two students who were men, and one of them committed suicide, and another of them probably died of an overdose.
Hmm.
Both in their 20s. It was just heartbreaking for me. And so I started looking for to understand this social contagion of depression among young people. And I stumbled across Johan Hari's book, Lost Connections. And as I read it, I really resonated to it because he described his autobiographically throughout the book. He described his journey out of depression, which began at the age of, I think, early mid teens, 15, 16, and how how down he was. And then finally, he got to a psychologist who diagnosed his depression and told him it was because his brain was malfunctioning and that there was a chemical agent, a drug he could take, which would correct the imbalance and make him better. And what Hari says in hindsight is he says, "Here at last I had a meaningful explanation of my misery.
Hmm.
I had a brain malfunction and I had hope a pill was going to um, fix this imbalance and I would feel better." And then he describes how the pill did help for a temporary period of time, maybe 5, 6 months, maybe a year. But eventually the medication would fail and he would be right back in the pit. And then the psychologist would prescribe a different medication. And the same cycle kept repeating itself, repeating itself, repeating itself. And he was a very smart and ambitious man, and he became a journalist. And he started applying his journalistic skills to research all the scientific literature on depression. And what he discovered was that the scientists and the pharmaceutical companies knew that the primary effect of the medication for common depression was the placebo effect. It gave a meaningful explanation of the misery and it offered hope. And that was enough to kick people out of the pits and get
Hmm.
them going again until the same syndrome repeated itself. And as now he acknowledges, of course, there are real mental illnesses like bipolar and schizophrenia and so forth, and these are indeed brain disorders which medication can materially help. But he's talking about common depression, the kind of depression that so many young people right now seem uh, almost like a contagion running through this younger generation. And then he did further research and he discovered that the clinical definition of common depression was had an exception in it. It was called the grief exception.
Hmm.
People who have suffered the loss of a deeply loved person in their lives go through a period of depression after the death of the loved one or a divorce or a separation or something like that. So they have an experience of grief. And the So it's the it's a scientific document called the inventory or something like that, which clinically describes depression. And it notes in there that people who have suffered a loss and are going through grief are not genuinely depressed. But of course, that begs the question, and Hari flips the question around. Could it be that most depression is unrecognized grief at lost connections? And then he has this, I think, rather searching analysis of the kind of mass society in which we've become, in which people have been separated from the cultural matrices that used to give them a platform and a shelter and a sense of purpose in life.
It sounds like, I mean that's a book that parallels very well with subjects that you return to a lot on with Sarah in your conversations. I'm wondering if you knew that when you picked the book up.
You know, I gathered a bunch of faculty colleagues at Roanoke College to read this book with me. And the reactions of the social scientists were very interesting. The psychologists, including some who are very biologically oriented, like the brain scientists and that type, were a little disappointed with the book. And they said, well, we already knew all this. This is no secret to us. Which kind of validates Hari's point, that, well, the public doesn't know it.
Yeah.
And then a sociologist who I really like, a Christian woman, a Methodist, made the comment that I want this book to be true because it corresponds to everything I think about life. That it is deep connections that facilitate mental health and stability. And it is the fragility of these connections. Yeah, I used to say to my freshmen after half a semester and they'd grown to trust me, I used to say, raise your hands. How many of you feel that your social relationships are predatory? Almost inevitably, everyone raised their hand. And this is at a relatively prosperous and happy liberal arts college.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's not only the relationships in college, but in the wider world. And so you have young people today looking at every relationship as a power relationship, which precludes the idea that you can surrender power in relationships of trust.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's a way of, I've thought about this before, that Luther's emphasis on vocation really does have the effect of putting us in healthy relationships with our neighbors.
And thinking that's really deeply thinking that that's the purpose why we're here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Paul, I'm really happy that we got a chance to talk.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I talked a lot. I hope it's been interesting.
It's been very good, and yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, but now